with our last shift tactic. So for those of you that didn't attend the last couple shifts, my name is Christine Dugan. I'm the team leader at KW Kauai, and today we're going to be talking about the last tactic out of the shift book as far as bulletproofing your transactions. And we have someone that has a lot of experience with this. So this is our principal broker here at KW Kauai and the OP or operating principal of our office, Richie Richardson, that is going to be sharing his, Richie, how many years? 30 plus years experience as being a broker and licensee here in Hawaii. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Richie, go ahead and take it away. I know we're excited to hear all of the resources and the value that you have for us today.
Okay, a few ground rules. First of all, turn off your phone or whatever, unless we're talking on it right now. Number two, this presentation is going to last about an hour and 45 minutes, and I'll save about 15 minutes for question and answer. If something does come up during the class, this is the kind of class where appropriate war stories sometimes help. And so if you have a comment or a personal experience or a transactional experience that you had recently and you want to raise your hand, who's going to be moderating? Christina, can you watch that?
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah, just watch that to see. So bulletproofing your transaction. My format for this class is I'm going to spend about the first half of the class going through these slides, which are right out of the shift book, and they're also available on the KWU site, I think. So if anybody wants a copy of these, I guess we can send them to you, or you can just get them there. And then after that, I have a list of 44 more specific points, which I don't have slides on. So you're going to want to take notes for this part. And if we get enough requests, I can get them all typed up. I just sort of ad-lib these things as I go along. So next slide. Okay, main ideas out of the shift book. Your perspective, inspections and repairs, appraisals, loan approval and funding, other contingencies, co-oping and communication, deadlines, and bulletproofing strategies. I'm mostly going to focus on the strategies, number 8. Our purchase contract, if we're talking about residential, is 14 pages long, not including any addenda there. And I think that when you're making your timeline on your transactions, it's particularly sensitive and important that you track your timeline. And if you are doing a good job of it, you're probably going to end up with about 160 to 180 points, depending on the relevant paragraphs in your contract. Not all paragraphs always apply, as you know. Next slide. Okay, perspective. Next slide. Classic case here. Owners feel like they're selling too low and buyers feel like they're paying too much. What's the market like over on Maui right now? Where are you in this cycle? Anybody?
Yes, I'm working with buyers right now, and they are definitely having pre-remorse, I call it. So they don't want to buy right now because they feel they'd be paying too much, unfortunately. So
buyer's remorse is really common, particularly in this kind of economic environment. Do you have any script or follow on when you get that kind of objection?
Well, I explained to them that it's never the wrong time to buy the right house. And also that, you know, most people don't say 10 years from now, gee, I wish I didn't buy that house. Most of us say, gee, I wish I would have bought that piece of real estate.
Yeah,
So
and
sorry.
the market you're selling in is the same one you're buying in. If you think about that.
They're foreign investors, so they're coming from Canada.
Uh-huh.
So they're not selling anything right now.
Oh, so they're just investing.
Well, they have work here, so they're under contract, so they want to live here for about 10 years.
There you go.
So they're a unique buyer as well. Yeah. So I call it pre-buyer's remorse because they haven't purchased yet. So anyway, yeah,
well,
thank you.
You're going to have to be prepared and get set up to counter those things as they come up. Next slide. In this market, a yes on a contract is not as solid as a yes in other markets. How many people agree with that? I would say I do, because in this market, things can fall apart very easily. Yeah, next slide. Okay, what's the solution? Be aware of the most common problems. Have good solutions and scripts. Avoid problems by addressing common concerns before they arise. That's key. Anticipate and maintain good and frequent communication. And I would say overriding and underlying all of this is to be very, very careful about setting your client's perspective, setting their expectations. What can they expect from you, and how frequently do they want you to communicate with them on? Next. Okay, getting the most out of this experience. I think everybody's seen this slide a number of times before. And of course, we all know that we're explorers. We're not vacationers and we're not prisoners. So thank you all for that. Next. 5 common problem areas. Buyer's remorse. We just heard a little bit about that. And setting the buyer's expectation is key. We talked briefly about that. What about inspections and repairs? What can you do to mitigate or handle that? Anybody?
From a listing perspective or a buyer's perspective? I'm sorry.
Either one.
Okay.
You're going to have it on both sides, right?
Yes. Well, I usually strongly suggest having a pre-inspection with listings, if possible, so that there's no surprises for the seller as well.
And how successful have you been with that?
In Canada, I was successful. I haven't really implemented that practice here yet, though.
Yeah, we do that. I do find that some sellers are a little reluctant to go through that process and expend the money. And we also get a fair amount of resistance to requests for repairs. It becomes a point of negotiation. What about appraisals? What are we seeing there? Anybody have any experiences?
Well, I am not doing any contract right now, but I've heard from the agents that are doing business that it's really, really more behind than ever.
The appraisals are coming in lower than before, right?
Right.
So what's a solution to that? Get more cash in the deal, right? So if you're looking at a contract and you don't have a lot of cash, if it's a really skinny contract, you're going to want to anticipate up front what you're going to do if the appraisal doesn't come in based on what the lender needs. Okay, then of course, loan approval and funding. Loan approvals are getting more difficult, less difficult?
More
I would say,
difficult.
yeah, I would say more difficult. In addition to that, two things are happening. One is people are losing their jobs, so they're not able to make payments. And tenants are sometimes falling arrears in rents. And what's happening with that? There's a moratorium on eviction, right? So you can be sitting there with your house occupied, a limited amount of income coming in, and perhaps no income, and no ability to cure. Difficult situation. Before I got on this call, I was speaking to one of our attorneys, and I was asking him what they're seeing. Moratorium is still in existence on evictions throughout the state, but the courts are now starting to open up. They just started to open up, and what he tells me is that they're going to take all of the highest priority cases first, and the landlord-tenant cases are piling up, and so they're probably going to take those towards the tail end of it, because they know once they start taking those cases, it's going to be an avalanche and it's just going to swamp the courts. Same goes for loan approvals and funding, much more difficult. And then finally, 5 common areas. I said in an earlier slide, you want to set expectations on how you're going to communicate. And my recommendation always is find out how they want you to communicate with them and how often. Next slide. Okay, buyer's remorse. Here's some proactive prevention. Outcome framing. What do you want to achieve? When I get into my 44 points, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Setting expectations. We already talked about that. Preparing alternatives. Go through a lot of what ifs. Look at every single paragraph in your contract and make sure that it's staying on track and that you have solutions if you get off track. And then, of course, reassure people saying we're doing fine. Next slide. Okay, buyer's remorse triggers. News reports that make them absolutely sure they've made the worst decision of their life. Are we in an environment like that right now? COVID's a pretty big unknown, isn't it? Yeah. Friends who tell them they're nuts for buying a home right now. I haven't heard too much about that, but I can see how that happens. Well-meaning family members or friends who say, you paid that much for your house? Oh my gosh. Next slide. Okay, the future depends on what you do today. Thank you, Mahatma Gandhi. Provide an antidote for buyer's remorse, mark the moment, and close as soon as possible. Moving quickly to closing is always preferable. The problem in our market today, though, is everything is slowing down, particularly with this COVID. Next slide. Mark the moment of victory. Write down how thoroughly you considered everything in the market and why this house is the one. That's supporting your buyer when they're putting in the offer. And that, if you can do that and achieve this before you write the offer, you'll be strong. Hopefully.
Bulletproofing your contract.
Okay, next slide. Antidote for buyer's remorse. Constantly resell buyers on their decision. Next slide. Seller's remorse. Do a CMA and show them where it comes out. Remind sellers of their motivation to move. Remind sellers about their destination and discuss the risks of starting over. How many times have you been in a situation where the buyer is remorseful, but you're not out of it, and the seller says, let's just get rid of them and start over, and you say, hey, we could be looking at 10, 12, 14 weeks or longer. Next slide. Close as soon as possible. difficult to do in our marketplace, given the systems that we have, particularly if you got to have a loan put in place. Next slide. Okay, early response, stay on track, constant communication, inspecting expectations, problem solving, and contract to close tracking. I talked about contract to close tracking, track every single date on every paragraph in your purchase contract. And as I said, I think that there's about 180 or so dates. I like to remind people that their deadlines are coming up. Remind them just a day or so before the deadline, and then ask them on the day things are due whether they've got it done or not. So that's like a 4-step process, and either you're going to be doing it as the agent or you're going to work with your transaction coordinator to get that done. And whatever you do, don't make any assumptions. Everybody knows about that word, assume. Okay, next slide. Handling buyer's remorse. What works when your buyer changes their mind about buying a house? Any thoughts on that? Any comments?
I think it's important to validate what they're feeling and what they're thinking, and then go back to reassuring them that they've made a good decision, that it is a good investment, and you know, at the time they really wanted to buy the home.
Yeah, and go back. Do you work with a buyer's questionnaire?
Yes.
I recommend that people do work with a buyer's questionnaire, and we'll touch on this. And go back to your buyer's questionnaire and review what they told you when you were first building your relationship with them. You know, remind them of the warm, fuzzy things that they were looking forward to. Anybody else have any other comments? Next slide. Inspection and repair. What happens when you have an inspection? First of all, it takes a while to get the inspection and get the report. At least I know it does here on Kauai. Does it take you a little while on Maui as well? That's a nod, I see it. Okay, so how can you work with your sellers on what to expect in your marketplace? Tell them in advance. You know, no house is perfect, right? So you should set their expectation that they're going to get requests for repairs following the home inspection that the buyer commissions, and they should probably prepare as much as possible and cover as many things on their home before the inspection even occurs. Acknowledgement of feelings and concerns, yes. You know, I understand how you feel. I know how you feel. I've felt that way before, and sometimes I've found that's a good script for that. Ask if sellers are willing to risk losing the buyer and going back through the entire lengthy period to find another one, and suggest a pre-inspection to prevent unexpected repairs. We talked a little bit about that. Next slide. Conversations with customers and buyers. Recommend inspectors you trust. I'm a little reluctant on this. If we're going to recommend anybody, we're going to give them a list of at least 3 names if we have them. Educate the buyers about where you are in the process and what comes next. Remind buyers that inspectors document everything they see, and help buyers focus on the big picture and important issues. Sometimes little things will pop up that nobody knew was there. Next slide. Attend inspections, your goals. Again, I'm a little bit different on this one. School's out for me on this. I'll go to an inspection to allow the inspector to go in but I recommend that our agents do not accompany the inspector. Get the report, and then you can look at it, read it, but don't go around with the inspector. I think that's a bad idea. Do share your inspection report with your client if you have this seller, and of course you're going to talk to the buyer about it if the buyer is yours. And don't let things get blown out of proportion. Vendor referrals if needed. Again, you know, for every contractor who's out there, they have some raving fans and they have some critical customers, and Hawaii just seems to be that way. Guiding buyers through the next steps. I think that it's important that you do this, but really, in fact, you need to be guiding your client through the entire purchase contract and every addenda, just letting them know what the next steps are and what to expect during that step. Next slide. Negotiation. Find out how much repairs will cost. Enlist the other agent as your ally, and adopt a positive mindset. Let's make a deal. Anytime repairs come up, there's going to be negotiation. So set your client's expectations and then do your best to help your client by negotiating on your client's behalf. Let me help with the cost of that repair. I'm not sure that I like that one. And I'll pick up 1/3 of that. I don't like that either. That's not something that I would make a habit of. Next slide. Home warranty. Home warranties alleviate buyers' worries, and in the future, when a repair is needed, new owners call the warranty company other than you. We've used home warranties from time to time here, and we find, though, that the contract and the underwriters seem to be a little bit non-responsive sometimes. I don't know what the experiences have been on the other islands. So home warranties are good, but you know, they're only as good as the contract they're written on. Next slide. Negotiating inspection and repairs issues. This is a key right here. When you receive the request for repairs after the buyer has had his inspection conducted, you're going to want to work on every single one of them and review it in the context of what the inspector wrote on his report. What are your best practices for resolving inspection issues? Next slide. Any comments on resolving inspection issues? Okay, I'll give you one. When you're trying to settle and negotiate among, first of all, identify the big rocks for the buyer, but secondly, never ever let your negotiation get down to just one big rock. Always keep two on the table. Why is that? You can give one and keep one. That's the answer. Next slide. Okay, funding, loan approval and funding. What's everybody's practice on Maui? How far along are you in the purchase contract before you get loan approval? Anybody? Comments, anybody? I can tell you here, we're usually getting our loan approval, and the contracts we write are written so that it's usually going to come in 14, 16 days before closing. Okay, regardless of which side you represent, make sure the buyer uses a reputable and trustworthy lender. We have found some flaky lenders, particularly of late. Next slide. Buyer side, make sure your buyers are pre-approved for a mortgage loan before showing them houses. That's a great suggestion. When you're filling out your buyer questionnaire, ask your clients if they have been pre-approved, and if they haven't been pre-approved, give them a list of 3 lenders that they can talk to and ask them if they have a preferred one, and ask them to go over and meet with that lender to see what it takes for them to get pre-approved. The next thing that I would do is I'd pick up the phone and I would call whichever lender it is that they've selected to go in to get a pre-approval, because then you can get an introduction on their behalf for your client. Offer names of 2 or more reputable lenders. Submit a parallel application for backup funding when you don't know or trust the buyer's lender, and advise your buyers on keeping their finances in good shape. One thing that we've noticed recently is a lot of the lenders are international in scope, and they're picking representatives that don't really know the marketplace in Hawaii. And so that doesn't help. In fact, it can be very complicated sometimes. So that's just a caution there. Next slide. Pre-qualified versus pre-approved. Anybody want to tell me what the difference is? Going once, going twice. Christine, can you tell me?
One is informal and one is formal.
Yes. Pre-qualified is a letter that the lender writes more or less when you send your client over and when they first meet with the lender. And if you look in the purchase contract, there's a list of criteria there that says that that pre-qualified letter needs to be based specifically on the review of the borrowers or the prospective borrowers' financial information. And if you get a letter like that, I would suggest that you pick up the phone and you call the lender and say, have you reviewed their tax returns, and have you looked at their financial information and this kind of thing? Because a lot of times you'll find out that they haven't done that. And if that's the case, you're going to have an uphill battle until you get that. So you really want a pre-approval as opposed to pre-qualification. If it's pre-approval, the buyer has already submitted his financial information and the loan officer has looked at it already. It may require some updating, but he's already looked at it, and then you're getting a much more qualified and accurate appraisal of what this buyer can do and is capable of. Next slide. Okay, 10 commandments of a loan application. I don't know how many times you guys have had deals fall out because your buyer is in the process of closing on his house and they're all excited and they decide to buy a new car or something like that. But this is a good list. And my recommendation is, if you're working with a buyer, print this list out and give it to them. Use it in your buyer's packet. So good list, nice 10 good items, and you can probably come up with a couple of others. Next slide. Anticipating and avoiding funding problems. What financing problems have you occurred? What's one that's common in our market today?
Losing their job.
Lost your job, or got laid off, or reduced hours. What can you do to avoid funding problems? Any thoughts? What if you ask the buyer up front how much cash they have, and of that cash, how much they plan on using in the transaction? If you're getting into a really skinny deal and he's got $15,000 in his bank account, and he's going to put 10 of that down on the house and use the other 5 for closing costs, you don't have much room to move, do you? So
No.
step them down to a lower valued house, or maybe work with them to find something that's more affordable for them. Or sometimes, like in markets we're in today, you can work on seller financing. Next slide. Okay, appraisals. Next slide. What can a real estate do to make sure the buyer gets an adequate loan to make the purchase? These days, more often than not a whole lot, are real estate agents in touch with appraisers? No, right? You're not allowed to influence them at all. When I first started in this business, we used to work with the loan officer to accept the to select the appraiser, and we could talk to the appraiser and tell them what we really thought about where the value was in the house. Can't do that anymore. Next slide. Low appraisers, what do you do with the sellers? Make sure that you have a thorough CMA up front so that you have a good idea where it's going to come out. That's proactive to avoid surprises. List the house at an appropriate price. Have an appraisal done if there's no comps. Can anybody think of anything else you might add to this? How about getting a pre-agreed to price reduction, or maybe 2 or maybe 3? If it doesn't sell in so many days, I agree, and I'm going to write in the listing contract that we're going to reduce the price on the house by $15,000. Next slide. Funding options, additional down payments from the buyer if they're not skinny. Financing gifts from parents and family, we've seen that quite a bit. Second mortgages and seller assisted options. We touched on all of those earlier. Next slide. Okay, dealing with appraisals. What appraisal problems have you encountered or heard about in your area? We were talking about this earlier. Anybody have any war stories they want to tell us? Are appraisals coming in where you're expecting them? Crickets. Next slide. I would tell you appraisals are not coming in where we're expecting them right now. Communication. Set your expectations and over communicate. Key players you want to communicate with: the escrow officer, the lender, the appraiser, real estate attorneys, title company, other real estate agents, buyers and sellers. And of course, you want to keep them all on your Christmas card list and get as much information every time. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Escrow officer, stay in communication as soon as the contract is signed. I find that the timelines that the escrow companies send out are rather abbreviated, and that they need to be expanded a bit to cover other eventualities that aren't covered. So I think developing a more comprehensive list is a good idea. Surveys and vendors. Avoid misunderstandings and differing expectations. Ask questions to get things in writing, and communicate early and often. Those are all kind of common sense. And of course, with any real estate transaction, everything should be in writing. And I can't tell you how many times I see transactions where you ask the agent if they have it in writing, and they said, no, I talked to them on the phone about that yesterday. So what's your response to that, anybody?
Make sure they write a document to send it to you to get it in writing.
Yeah, and some agents are difficult to encourage to put it in writing. So have the conversation with them on the phone and say, and then send them a follow-on email that essentially summarizes what you discussed and what was agreed to. And I prefer that you use emails rather than text, although the younger generation likes text. What's the problem with text that you don't have with email?
Texts don't hold up in court.
They're difficult in court. What about the chain of communication? Is it clear with a text or only related emails? If you have everything in an email thread, in my opinion, that's a more complete history of the communication than if you just have little thought balloons in the form of text messages. You know, when things were sent, who sent them, who was copied on them, etc. Next slide. Communication is a big deal, by the way. What questions should you ask to avoid problems in the contract to close process? Anybody think of any? I think they're focusing on your well, all of the interested parties that we just talked about, but begin with your client. Any thoughts? Next slide. Okay. Seller's financial situation. If the seller is your client, of course, you want to get as much financial information as you can, but you also want to talk to the seller's agent, if you're not the seller's agent, to attempt to uncover problem areas that you might run into during the course of the transaction. Not all seller's agents are going to open up with you, but if you're nice and you're pleasant and you explain to them that, you know, the more information you have about the seller's situation, the more successful we'll be in completing the transaction or in removing hiccups, that can go a long way. How much of a loan do they have outstanding? How can you get that information?
Isn't it in the text of the property tax information?
You can get it off of the TMK if you're accessing that system, but that loan amount is going to be when the loan was originated. So there's two things that you can do. The first one is to estimate the amount of time that's lapsed and ask them if they're current from the time they originated the loan until today. And you can get out your handy dandy qualifier 2FX or 3FX and run some numbers to see roughly what it's been amortized down to. The other thing is get permission to call their lender and ask the lender if they can give you an idea of what the outstanding balance is. So that's how much the seller owes the lender and whether or not there's a second mortgage. Don't ever assume, this is good guidance here, that the seller's agent has been thorough about questioning their client about the relevant information so that they can disclose it to you if they have it. When I'm selling and I'm working with people, I sometimes come across as a little bit pushy with the other agent's client. And if the client will let you do that, fine. Otherwise, pose all of your questions to the seller's agent and ask them to get the answers for you. Next slide. Bottom line, next slide. Communicate often with all key people. Spend plenty of time with your customers. Over communicate. Handle or closely oversee the contract to close process. I think in today's marketplace, most of our agents use the services of a transaction coordinator. And I think that you've got to keep your finger in the pie on that, because I don't think a transaction coordinator is going to communicate and build the relationship in the same manner that you would. Anticipate problems and take preventive action to avoid them. That's what I mean when I say make a real thorough checklist with all of the open items on your purchase contract. Understand the mindset of the buyers and the mindset of the sellers. Look for creative solutions and never give up. Next slide. Okay, this is just a chart of our career growth initiative, and if people are in the Keller Williams system and have access to systems, you'll see all of this. If you don't, if anybody wants to talk about the language of real estate and the systems that we're using, I'm available. If you'd like to call me up, I'm happy to share with you. Next slide. Okay, this is just the process that we use in Keller Williams. This is a Gary Keller model. Using this model, you can calculate the number of listing appointments you need to go on in order to track and plan for a certain number of listings that you want, which is of course based on your income and how successful desired income and how successful you want to be financially. The wall of value is what you bring to the table as an agent. Third step is closing your listings and your buyers. And of course, we all know that we prefer to have listings rather than buyers, but a lot of people are more comfortable with buyers. It's up to you. And finally, you reach your gross commission income and your projected profit. Next slide. Okay, we're getting to the end of it. There is an action plan on page 51 to 53 of your guide. Don't put this guide down and not pick it up again. Go back and take a look at this and decide what steps you can take to improve your performance as an agent and elevate your professionalism and consequently the level of income to which you would like to become accustomed. I hope I said that right. Next slide. Okay, take the other courses in the Shift Tactics series. There they are. This is really pretty much the end of this presentation. So now I'm going to shift to my 44 points that I have that you can use to bulletproof your transaction. And for many of you, these points won't be new, they'll be refresher. And in many cases, I borrowed them from other people, so they're not original thoughts about mine, of mine. So I would say the first thing that I would guide you to is to begin with the end in mind. Before you even start writing your purchase contract, know where you want to end up. And in order to know where you want to end up, that means you have to have a thorough understanding of where your client wants to get to, because this really isn't your goal, it's your client's goal, and you're just the instrument that gets your client across the goal line at a level that she wants, okay? So begin with the end in mind, and just remember, it's not about you, it's not about your commission, it's not about your payday, it's always about your client. Okay, writing a successful contract requires a thorough understanding of the language of the standard form, the property being sold, and the wants and needs of the parties involved, as well as strong general real estate skills. So those are all of our goals. Some of us have been exposed to many contracts throughout our career, and others are just starting out, and you're just beginning. So number one, get a sample contract and practice filling it out. Practice with your buddies, go through it. Excuse me, if you have technical questions, ask your principal broker or any other broker you can talk to, and other agents. Avoid the unauthorized practice of law. That's my number two. We're not attorneys, and we should avoid using legalese. I can't tell you how many times I see people that draft contracts and they start using all of these convoluted words that are bigger words, and they're not writing the same way they talk. And my biggest recommendation to avoid this is just write the way you talk. You know, it doesn't have to be complicated. Next item, use standard forms whenever possible and study the standard forms. I typically say that you need to know the standard forms well enough so that you know them upside down. And by that, I mean, when you're sitting with your client at a table and going over the purchase contract, you're going to turn the contract over and put it under his nose so that it's upside down to you, but you're going to know that contract well enough so that you can track the paragraphs with your finger and tell them what it says and what it means. How often are standard forms updated? Anybody know?
Every 6 months.
Yeah, you want to, standard forms are updated 2 times a year, and that doesn't mean that they redo all of the standard forms 2 times a year, but it does mean that their dates get changed 2 times a year. So always make sure that you're using the most current standard form. And remember that just because it's a standard form, it doesn't mean that it can't be modified or supplemented. So don't be afraid to cross out a paragraph or add to a paragraph. If you have access to your company's procedure manual, use it. Not all companies have it. Sometimes things are moving very quickly, and so if you don't have access to a standard purchase contract manual, then get in front of your broker and your agent friends and communicate with them, and start your communication before the purchase contract is written. A lot of us get impatient and they want to finish the purchase contract, put it in front of their broker, get their broker's signature, and get it off to their client. And the caution I have is, if you're starting out, you better figure on 4 hours at least to do your purchase contract. And remember that in real estate transactions, everything is going to take twice as long as what you thought. Okay? Have one of your peers review your purchase contract before you pass it on to your principal broker for review and approval. And always be guided by your client's wishes and desires. If they want to go in a certain direction, as long as it's legal and within the scope of the contract, that's where you need to go. If possible, make a rough draft of your purchase contract first. And if you have a rough draft, have your broker review it. I mean, you can tell, I can tell when I look at contracts how skilled people are in preparing purchase contracts. And the first couple times I get a hold of somebody's contract, you probably have a lot of red ink or a lot of green ink on it, because there are things that you just didn't think about before. And if you're working with me anyway, if you have a question about something, what am I going to ask you, Catherine?
If I have a question about what kind of question?
Any kind of question. What am I going to ask you?
Did I talk to my client first?
Yeah, your client, and then I'm going to say, what do you think, right?
Yes, you always ask me that. That's
because I want you to tell me where you think this should go. And once I know that, then I can give you a much better answer to your question when we're going through it. Okay. How many standard forms are there? Anybody know? I think they're 53, and that's not including anything that your brokerage prepared. So you should know what those are, and always be sure that you review all of the standard forms and pick all of those that apply. One of the ones that I have mixed emotions about lately is our newest standard form, which is the COVID-19 standard form. And I'm just not really sure that it helps either party, actually. I think I said this already, but just remember all the terms of the purchase contract are negotiable. Get all agreements and disclosures in writing. We mentioned that before in the prior presentation, but it's worth repeating. I grew up in the days of paper transactions. We're now doing digital transactions. And one of the things that I think suffers quite a bit in the digital environment is we don't paper our transaction the way we used to. And so you really have to pay attention to collecting and building up a file of all of your correspondence, communication, and other relevant pieces of data that pertain to the transaction. So I think we suffer a little bit right now in our digital environment because of that. We forget about some of our communications and things. Be sure that your contract covers the entire transaction, and make sure that your file covers the entire transaction. In advance, anticipate and deal with potential problems before they happen. To the buyer, what happens if the house doesn't appraise and you're asked to come up with more cash? Are you able to do it? That's an example. Keep the contract simple. Contracts don't have to be wordy. They don't have to be complicated. Just keep them simple and clearly convey the intent of the parties, and do it all in writing. If you can't, if you had a conversation verbally and you are wanting to confirm something, then do it in writing. There are many parts to the contract, lots of different paragraphs, and make sure that the different parts of the contract are consistent. One of the ones that I commonly run into is the section in the purchase contract requesting a termite inspection, where the buyer gets to identify the inspector, and then the or maybe the buyer pays for the inspection. Purchase contract says that the seller agrees to make certain repairs. Seller may not necessarily be in agreement with that, and you need to look at the addenda to make sure that the addenda is using similar wording to the purchase contract. So you've got to double check back and forth between them. Avoid legalese. I talked about that. you're not attorneys, or unless you are an attorney, I guess I should say, don't act like an attorney. Be careful about pronouns. I have an example here. In the event the seller is unable to close on the specified date and the buyer will not agree to an extension, he may declare this offer null and void. Who's he? You have to be real careful about those kinds of references. They get circular. Type or print or use your computer to prepare your purchase contract. I really love zip forms. I like everything in zip forms, and I like everything typed. Occasionally I see a handwritten one because you just couldn't do it in time, but try to get yourself in a place where you can do it. Don't leave any blank spaces. For those of you that have had me review your contracts, you know this is a pet peeve of mine. That's probably the biggest source of errors in preparation of a purchase contract. The little parentheses, the ellipsis up to the left of the number of the paragraph says NA, but in the body of the paragraph, there's a date or there's some writing that the agent put in. Well, which is it? Is it the writing, and did we make a mistake saying that this paragraph didn't apply, or is it the opposite? So you have to make sure that you don't leave any blanks, fill them in, even if you're just putting NAs in it. And I think finally, HAR has most of their forms to the point where you can put NA. It used to be that some of the fields were only numeric fields, and you had to figure out a workaround so that you could get NA, which is alpha, in there. Important numbers. Any important numbers, you should state them both ways. Write out the numbers and then write them out in words. Be realistic about time frames. The dates in the purchase contract do not sequentially correspond to the dates on the calendar. And what I mean by that is that sometimes something happens in paragraph 1 or paragraph 2 that's towards the end of the contract in terms of time frame, and other things need to be done earlier, and that's towards the end of the contract, but it's early on when somebody has to take action. So be careful about it. Track your dates meticulously, and always use calendar days. I not frequently, but I sometimes see people using the term business days, and I think there actually are some of our standard forms on the commercial side that still include the term business days, but whenever possible, you got to use calendar days. It just avoids confusion. If you run out of space, use an addenda. Don't try to squeeze it in, and don't skim. If you're gonna run over by a line or two in section Q on your purchase contract, just put the addenda on and add a couple of lines on it. Don't be lazy and write a weaker contract as a consequence. Physically attach all addenda to the contract and all other materials. And I would add that if you're sending your purchase contract to your broker or broker in charge for review, provide them with that detail as well, because many of you that work with me or have worked with me know that I'll ask about that stuff, and I will double check the TMK numbers and other things like that. Whenever possible, this is a good one, avoid the use of contingencies. You know, contingencies are only necessary if there's an event that has to happen later, and as a consequence of the outcome of the event, one or the other party to the contract gains a certain right, like a right to cancel or a right to extend or something like that. state contingencies as clearly as possible and break them apart, make them separate. Each contingency should stand on their own. A lot of times I see people putting some of their contingencies in section Q, and they start running out of space and lines down on the bottom. So the last contingency actually has about 3 separate ones all in one number. That's not a good idea. Get your addenda out and add it in there. Keep track of your contingency timelines. I've already talked about making a really good timeline. Make sure the client knows where to sign the contract and all of the addenda. How many times have you seen a contract where not all the pukas have been filled in? That's pretty common. Make sure all changes are initialed and dated. So anything where the contract has been changed at all, either from a typewritten paragraph or something that has been handwritten in, make sure that it's initialed and dated. And that's by all parties, by the way. Don't ever sign for your clients. That's an absolute no-no with me. You're not going to sign. Sometimes clients will say, can you please initial that for me or something like that? The answer is no. You can't do that at all. And of course, we're not accepting powers of attorney either. So no POAs. This is a good rule. A copy of everything to everyone every time. Every time somebody signs something, you give them a copy. So go into that meeting prepared and have the copy for them. You don't want them leaving a room without walking away with a copy. Always use the counteroffer forms when, if at all possible. And that's really a great form, actually. I like that. A lot of times I see people not using it, but that's not a good idea. And I talked about your time. Take your time. And again, I'll remind you, everything takes twice as long as you think it is. This is a good one. When in doubt, disclose. Or to say it another way, err on the side of disclosure. If you have any doubt in your mind, counsel your client that they need to make that disclosure. And always be sure that you're drafting your contracts and their amendments to minimize your liabilities. Keep that in mind. And if a problem comes up, get on it right away. I mean, get in and talk to your broker in charge or whoever your reviewing broker was, number one. And if necessary, get in touch with an attorney or advise your client that they should consult with an attorney before they make a decision. And I'm not sure about, for agents that are on this call that are with another brokerage, do you folks or do your brokers have access to the legal hotline? Anybody? Anybody?
I
I've
don't
got
know.
crickets here. You're not sure?
That's correct. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I can tell you in our brokerage, so at least for our agents, we do have access to a legal hotline. So although I may have an opinion about something or some other broker in charge might have an opinion about something, if you're unsure, I mean, I'm on the phone to the legal hotline weekly and more frequently. And you pay one fee a year. I think it's about $350 for the whole year. And you get to call on an unlimited basis. So if you're working with a broker that doesn't have access to it, you should encourage them to take advantage of it. And they can do that through the Hawaii Association of Realtors. I use it all the time. And I guess the last thing that I would leave you with is follow the golden rule. You know, you don't have to be, I mean, always be fair and courteous. Just because you're on the other side of a transaction, it doesn't mean that your bedside manner should change. Just maintain those relationships all the time. This isn't about making friends and enemies or anything like that. It's about being effective in getting a transaction closed with a minimum amount of problems for all involved and on a timely basis. Okay, so I'm done with that. Any questions? Anybody?
No, that was a good job.
Okay, was there a new thought for you?
I think it's just a good idea to make sure you understand all the addendums too, and what they are, and that they exist, and plus the ones that you have with your company.
Yeah, exactly. And I might add, I'm glad you brought up again that we were just having a conversation about that today. Some companies' addenda actually modify the verbiage in the purchase contract. And if I see addenda like that, and I see that it's modifying, first of all, people don't read those addenda carefully enough to realize exactly what it's doing. And sometimes some of the addenda give protection to brokers on one side, but not to brokers on the other side, as an example. I won't sign those things. If I see that coming up, we're taking that out of the contract. That's something that one side added or another side added, and it's really not necessary to the transaction. So you want to be very careful when you're reviewing addenda and making sure that they're not changing the purchase contract unless the change is evident and apparent, and that's the intent of the addenda. Other comments or questions?
Is there a difference between addendum and addenda?
Yeah, one's plural, one's singular.
But I thought there was another one, another type of contract, but it wasn't. It's similar to the word addendum or addenda, and there was something else though.
That's an amendment.
Ah, amendment. That's right.
Yeah, you can get addenda, and you can also have an amendment to the contract.
Okay.
And in both cases, there are actually blank forms prepared by HAR that you can use to your heart's content if you need one. It just comes with the heading and the realtor logo and things like that.
Okay.
Richie, I have a question.
Yes.
I have a client who's doing a high-end purchase, and he is unwilling to provide proof of funds. He's also unwilling to have an attorney or escrow verify those funds. But he is willing to do a non-refundable deposit upon clearance of J1. So I'm trying to figure out if anybody's ever seen that, first of all, before, because in 20 years, I've never had anybody refuse to give a proof of funds, or if anybody's got any success tactics that we could use to kind of skirt that issue, because I know it's going to come up. We're the buyer, and the seller's agent is a top agent in town.
Yeah, so no proof of funds. How much cash is in the transaction?
10 mil.
Cash.
Yeah, it's an all cash deal. He's willing to put up a non-refundable of 500.
500,000.
Yes, 500,000.
Yeah. You know, if you get into something like that, and you said his 500,000 would be non-refundable.
Right, and that was his idea, not mine, by the way.
Yeah, that's probably one of the first places I would have gone if he's going to be hard-headed about it and isn't going to. Then because your resistance is going to come from the seller's agent and subsequently the seller, right? And and so you're right out of the box, you're creating a situation where you enable the seller's agent to go to their client. And I would actually coach the agent this way and say, look, you know, I know that it's unusual that he's not going to provide proof of funds. He doesn't want to put anything up, but his $500,000 is non-refundable. And, you know, the worst case for your client is that he's tied up for however long the closing period is. And then he gets a $500,000 payday. You know, that sounds like the downside to me. And I think what I would try to do if he's putting up that non-refundable deposit, I think I would try to negotiate, if I were on the seller side, to get that non-refundable deposit dispersed from escrow early on. You know, maybe right after the building the inspection or the J1 inspection or something.
Yeah, that's how we have it structured. So it's $500,000 non-refundable upon approval of a J1.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, and how long for closing?
You know, unfortunately, he needs 45 days rather than 30. But you know, that's the reason why when you were talking about the COVID addendum, I don't really like that addendum either, because it kind of doesn't seem to benefit either party. It kind of gives the seller the advantage on especially in this case with a non-refundable deposit. But we checked the first box, so I think we're okay on that. Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's where I would go with it. It's unusual, I agree. But I think it's solvable because he's putting so much cash into the deal up front and he's willing to make it non-refundable. And I would just disperse it to the seller as soon as they clear their inspection contingency.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate
Any
it.
other questions?
Richie, I'm sorry, I've been cutting in and out, and you may have said this already, but are we required to use the COVID? I mean, I'm hearing you say it's not a good thing for either party. So, do we have to use it? It's not part of the contract.
There's nothing that says you have to.
Okay.
And I have really mixed emotions about that particular form. It's out there, and it basically gives either party, for circumstances beyond their control related to COVID-19, the right to cancel. And I mean, I don't need COVID-19 to write that into a contract. If you think about your contingencies and say, hey, if you don't get this done, I get the right to cancel. In fact, through a judicious use of one of the O paragraphs, O1 to O4, you can be selective about how and who gets to cancel.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Richie.
Anybody else? All good questions. Well, I'm at an hour and 15 minutes, so you guys got some spare time here. Did I go over anything too quickly? Okay, well, I'm all done then.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
see
Richie.
Thank you, Ricky.
Participants, you guys are all very welcome. And as always, whenever I have somebody in training classes like this, if you have a technical question, you know, feel comfortable in calling me, give me some time to respond to you. And even if you're not with our brokerage and you have a technical question, if you call me up, tell me what brokerage you're with. I'm going to ask you if your broker knows that you're calling me. And if your broker doesn't know, then I'm going to want you to hang up and tell them that you're going to call me just to do a little bit of research on something. But once you tell me, yes, my broker knows I'm calling you, then I'm happy to help you. All
Thank
righty.
you so much.
Thank
This
you
has
so
been
much.
super valuable.
Okay.
Thanks
Well,
for
everybody
sharing.
behave themselves and do good with your contracts and transactions. And don't forget that Bold Pivot is starting up on July 14th.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you. Aloha.